And what you saw the entire 20th century was every single decade women were gaining more and more rights, right? The Progressive Era was a lot of women, right? They were doing lots of stuff. The 20s, after the Progressive Era, women had the right to vote. Women were now drinking and smoking and wearing shorter skirts and dancing and were...
Having sex with whoever they liked. Jimmy Jones.
What did you say?
Jimmy Jones. Pretty solid.
Women were becoming a lot more modern. The 30s was sort of different, although every single decade women were going to college more and more. In the 50s, women take this big step back. A lot of women were going to college, but just to get their MRS degree, right? What's that mean? Your MRS degree.
You go to college to find a man.
You go to college looking to find your husband, right? And then once you find your husband, you drop out. Oh, really?
She didn't actually go to college. But like, the only time in her life she's ever had like an actual job was before she got married, and then when she got married, she like never like worked at a real job.
When I was a transient, we got there, and a professor, our entire class, like you go through, when you guys go to college, especially if you go to like a liberal arts college, it's, you know, even if you don't, usually the freshmen, there's like a couple days where it's just freshmen on campus, you know, you kind of get ingratiated to the school and stuff. Well, transient was pretty small, so we were all in this auditorium, and people were asking us questions. I remember them asking us, how many of you here think that you'll find your spouse at transient? And I would say that 75% of the class will raise their hand. And I mean, a crap ton of people got married, transient people got married. Because it's a smaller community. But that being said,
It's also the time of your life.
yeah, the thing is that people are like, oh, that's the most ridiculous thing ever, meeting your spouse in college. That actually happens more than you think it does.
Yeah.
But that being said, today, when Kelly and I started dating, Kelly didn't drop out. I found my man, right? Time to drop out. That would have been really bad for the Coopers.
I'm glad you said that.
Oh yeah. Oh, we give him a lot of. I mean, we're all kind of jealous. Not jealous, but we're all kind of like, we'll make fun of them, and they're like, okay, yeah, your house is the size of a county.
I was telling my dad last night.
Right. Aha.
Aha, you're 80
Right. Right. You have a bouncy house in your basement.
I was telling my dad I'm just gonna find me a stay-at-home man.
Yeah, I mean.
House all gone.
Keep a clean house. My wife is desperate to stay home, except she doesn't want to stay home, like, with the kids. She only wants to stay home with no kids. She still wants me to get them ready in the morning and take them to school, and then her just hang out at home. And I was like, I think that's more called laziness than it is taking care of the house. She's like, I probably would get up and make you breakfast, maybe. So when Betty Friedan is writing this, she is writing this book. She had gone to Smith College, which is a really, really good school. And what she had noticed over the years was a lot of, not only her, because she had stayed at home and raised 3 kids, but a lot of her and many of her classmates had not done what they had set out to do when they went to school at a time, that women saw themselves as being an integral part of the workforce. And she did a survey and found that these women were not satisfied. Is that an accurate statement, you think, Emma Lou, or anyone who read Feminist Tea? And so she began doing some pretty extensive research, and she wrote The Feminine Mystique. If ever there was a book that began a major revolution, you know, outside of like the Communist Manifesto, if ever there was a book in America that started a social revolution, this was it. I mean, we talked a lot about the muckrakers, right, the Progressive Era, and in each one of those muckrakers is bringing a specific thing, you know, like tenement issues or corruption of business. This is calling out an entire gender. Now, if you've read Feminine Mystique, who's she calling out? Women. She's not calling out men. Now, she might not like the society that men have controlled, but many people who think that these 60s and 70s feminists were just a bunch of men haters and army boots is not necessarily accurate. This book set a very intellectual framework and was pretty hard to argue against once you looked at her evidence. And this was in 1963, and soon after, you start getting the civil rights movement really blossoming into, I mean, it was already blossoming, and it's becoming a thing women are beginning to take off, the Vietnam War starting, and now you have so much social change going on at one time. This is one reason why conservatives have always been reticent to embrace the 60s, because there was so much social change. Today, they're talking about on NPR today about how people have looked at gay marriage so much differently. I mean, over the last 10 years, it has radically changed. It's only been 10 years, right? People of your generation, on average, tend to not care about gay marriage. Like, it's not even a big deal, right? And there are obviously some who aren't like that, but well, you're talking about massive social change. And then you add, there's a Hispanic movement going on, the early parts of gay rights movement going on, Native American movements going on, and you're talking about a lot of social change. And conservative white dudes are sitting there looking around thinking, where'd my America go? And she establishes and founds an organization called NOW, National Organization for Women. NOW is still I'm surprised that Emma Lou is not the Anderson County president of NOW. I don't think Anderson County has a president of NOW, actually. And what NOW was pushing for were women's rights. A big one was going to be abortion rights and the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA. If you'll remember, and if you do, that's pretty amazing, Alice Paul, we remember Alice Paul, right? After the women's suffrage movement, she was pushing for the Equal Rights Amendment, essentially equal pay for equal work. This failed in the 20s. In fact, it came up again in the 1980s, and it also did not pass. The argument was the 14th Amendment is enough, right? Equal citizenship. But women are going to become more organized, and from this point on, women have made strides socially that were almost unimaginable. Today, women go to college more often. Women do better in school. To this year, yeah, I would say if you're not, you're almost. And now there is not parity in every single job. Like doctors, more men are doctors, although women are gaining on men. A few women are lawyers, although women are gaining and going to law school now. It used to be women doctors were women doctors, right? Kind of like male nurses, right? But today, no one calls Dr. Cooper a female nurse, right? It's not a weird thing. The only place that women have had a really hard time breaking down is in the corporate board office. Women CEOs of major corporations are still a relatively rare thing. Meg Whitman, who ran Hewlett-Packard and ran for Republican governor in California, she is an example of somebody who did break the glass ceiling. A few have, but this is the big one, is women in business. And one reason is because of children. A lot of these women are thinking that they have to make a decision. So for instance, if you're in the corporate office, you are trying to move up, right? You're trying to impress. But let's say, and most of these women are very educated. And normally what we're seeing in society, it used to be women were looking for a man who was an intellectual equal, but was more superior to her in terms of education to take care of. Today what you're starting to see, and I don't know if you noticed this, but in like my generation and people who are your age, are marrying people who have similar educational levels, right, and similar outlooks. And because of this, women who are on the sort of a corporate ladder, they're married to people who also do pretty well. And so what happens is, when they get pregnant, these women can afford to stay home for a couple of years, and it's important for them to be with their child. When they come back into the workforce, what has happened? Everyone that was with them before has moved ahead, and they're now right here, right? And so some women feel like they have to make a choice between being a mother, which isn't necessarily an anti-feminist thing, right? I mean, being a mother is important to women, whether they're feminist or not feminist, right? But do you be a mother, or do you give that up so you can compete in the business world? And a lot of women don't think that's fair. Most European countries, specifically in Northern European countries, that's not really an issue. You just get paid time off. But that's one reason why in the corporate world there is a distinctive difference in pay between men and women, because men don't have to take that much time off for, if you have 2 kids, you might have to take off 2 years, right? And if you do that, you're 2 years behind. And in the mind of many corporate executives, if you're willing to take off time for your kid, that's sometimes seen as a weakness.
Why is it like that? I feel like it's also like that in like political disputes, like the Senate, and like just I feel like there's not as many women like senators and
There's not only women politicians, although I will say this is the highest we've ever had in women politicians. They're becoming, the more women politicians we have, I think the more this is going to change. And it probably will get a little bit better from this perspective. But you're right, it has been hard, and I think that Hillary Clinton's been a really big, important part of that. Now, she was not the first woman in Congress, obviously, but she has been the big, her and Nancy Pelosi have been gigantic female voices in Washington. Now, if you're a tough female, what are you called? You're called the B word, right? But she stood up to it, and she's pretty impressive. I mean, she's been, she was on the Hill before she ever got even married, and then she was a professor, a law professor, and then she ended up, you know, she was a first lady, but she was in charge of the health thing. Then she was a senator, and then she was one of the most successful secretaries of state in the last 50 years. She's and ran for president, first woman to ever get a primary win. So hopefully people will see that women can do that, and it will sort of change the laws. But that's where we're at. I mean, but think about it. This hasn't been that long. 40 years we've gone from Betty Friedan writing this book to, you know, a woman winning a presidential primary. We went from 40 years before this, a black guy had to pay to vote in Mississippi, to 40 years later, a black guy's president. Right? Now, I know social change doesn't happen fast enough for most liberals, but in the grand scheme of things, that if you would have told a Southerner in 1965 that in 40-something years there'd be a black liberal from the North as president, he'd have headed for the hills.
He already lives in the
And women running are pushing, and now pushing for abortion rights, will finally have their day in court in 1973 in the court case Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade came out of, remember what state it came out of, Emma? Came out of Texas. This woman, you remember that from your, this woman claimed, in Texas, the only time you can get an abortion was if you were raped back then. And she claimed that she was raped, although she ended up admitting that she wasn't. So she sued to have her right. Only 2 or 3 states had abortion rights. Back then it was a state issue. California and New York did. So she ended up suing for her right. Her name was not Roe, but they called her Jane Roe to protect her identity. She ended up having the child because by the time the court case got to the Supreme Court, she'd already, you know, had long had the kid. Ironically, by the way, she is one of the leading pro-life advocates in the country. She has changed her tune on this and is now pro-life.
That's really, really ironic.
Well, I'm sure if she wanted to get her to get an abortion so bad, why don't she just go to California and do it?
Well, if you're a poor person with no money, getting a car to go to California.
Yeah. Well, I'd say I can see how that would change your tune, though. I mean, like, you have to raise this kid, and you would.
Yeah.
That's the thing. I mean, you guys will, and this is going to sound dopey, but you know your parents always talk about like I don't believe in love at first sight. I don't think you look at your spouse and like, that's the one forever. But I will say when you see a kid, you're like, it's just sort of different. Yeah, I mean, you're like, if you have this kid and you're like, well, I sure wish I would have aborted you. I don't think any rational person says that. And so that probably had something to do with it. But that would be a really bad thing for your parents to tell you, though, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Man, if I would have only aborted you, none of this would have happened.
Isn't she on like a commercial now saying that?
Yeah, she's done advertisements. I forget her. I should know her name. I've forgotten it. And then comes later. This was in '73. This was not Earl Warren. This was Warren Burger, the Burger Court. Burger was put on the Supreme Court. We'll get to this later. He was put on the Supreme Court by Nixon. And Nixon, much like Eisenhower, thought he was getting a conservative on the court and ended up not getting a conservative. Berger's going to not only allow for abortion, but he's also going to say that the death penalty is unconstitutional. So 2 times in a row, these conservative Republicans put these guys on the court thinking, we got ourselves a conservative. And it kind of backfired.
How do you accidentally...
Well, a lot of it, though, is once these people have, their only job is to consider the constitutionality of issues, and not politics, then sometimes the framework of your analysis changes, right? And so how you see the world changes because you are no longer bound to public opinion.
Has there ever been a...
You are public.
Oh, I think of getting a liberal, and they turned out to be
There has been, I think I'm getting a crazy liberal,
Yeah.
and they're more moderate. Yeah. Nothing like, and to be fair, both Eisenhower and Nixon, they were not absurdly conservatives. I mean, they were not
Right.
absurdly
I
conservative.
feel like Eisenhower was really that conservative too.
No, in fact, you know what Rachel Maddow, Andrew's favorite woman in the world, you know how she refers to herself politically? She calls herself an Eisenhower Democrat.
She won that one.
Okay, now let's talk about something that Mary Lee hates. Title IX.
Love Title IX.
Andrew, why do you not like Title IX?
Women's basketball.
Women's basketball, you're right. Our women's basketball team